The loan officer didn't even look up from her screen when she said it. Sir, honestly, I don't think it's worth either of our time to keep going through this. Gerald Finch sat across from her in a small, beige cubicle on the third floor of Meridian Trust Bank, wearing a cardigan that had gone slightly thin at the elbows, a modest wristwatch that told time and nothing else, and the unremarkable, slightly tired posture of a 71-year-old man who had spent the morning waiting in a lobby chair before finally getting called back. He was applying for a small personal loan, $8,000, nothing dramatic. The kind of amount that shouldn't have required more than 15 minutes and a signature. He had been sitting there for 40. I understand the concern, Gerald said evenly. But if you'll look at the account history rather than just the credit score. I think I've looked at it, the officer. A brisk 26-year-old named Kayla Simmons said, still not fully looking at him. Your income documentation is thin, sir. I really can't approve this without stronger proof of steady earnings, and honestly, at your age, taking on new debt like this isn't usually advisable anyway. She said it the way people say things they've said many times before, worn smooth from repetition. The specific flat courtesy that comes from having made the same judgment about the same category of person more times than she could count. Older, modest clothing. No employer letterhead, because retired men rarely have one. In her mind, the file was already closed before Gerald had finished his second sentence. Perhaps I could speak with someone else, Gerald offered. Not unkindly, simply factually. You're welcome to, Kayla said, already reaching to close the folder. But I promise you'll get the same answer. We really can't be spending this much time on applications like this. Gerald Finch owned Meridian Trust Bank. Not a majority shareholder in the way that appears in filings with a dozen other names. Attached, the actual controlling owner. The man whose holding company had quietly acquired the bank 11 years earlier and had spent every year since deliberately, almost obsessively, staying out of its own headlines. He didn't sit on the customer-facing board. His name appeared nowhere in the branch. He had built his fortune decades earlier in an entirely different industry, and when he bought Meridian Trust, it had been for one reason only. He'd grown up watching his own mother get turned away from banks exactly like this one. And he'd wanted, for reasons that were more personal than financial, to own a place where that could be fixed from the inside. 4 times a year, he visited a branch unannounced, dressed exactly like this, applying for something small and ordinary, just to see what actually happened to a person nobody in the room recognized as powerful. However, neither Kayla Simmons nor anyone else on the third floor of that branch had any idea that the tired-looking man in the thin cardigan, being quietly dismissed over an $8,000 loan, was the person whose decisions had built the building they were sitting in, and that within the hour, every assumption she'd made about him was about to collapse in front of the entire branch. I appreciate your time, Gerald said, standing slowly, the cardigan catching slightly on the arm of the chair. He didn't argue further. He'd learned over 11 years of these visits that arguing rarely revealed anything useful. The moment itself, the reflexive dismissal, told him everything he needed to know about how his own institution treated the people who needed it most. He was 3 steps from the elevator when the branch manager, a composed man named Deshaun Whitfield, who had worked at Meridian Trust for 6 years and had met Gerald exactly once, at a private ownership meeting 2 years prior, stepped out of his office holding a coffee mug and stopped mid-sip. Mr. Finch? The floor didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet when only 1 or 2 people notice something first. And then the silence spreads outward as everyone else follows their eyes to whatever those first people are looking at. Kayla, still sitting in her cubicle with Gerald's folder half closed in front of her, looked up at the sound of her manager using a name she didn't recognize, delivered in a tone she'd never heard Deshaun use with anyone. Deshaun, Gerald said, turning, entirely unbothered, the same even tone he'd used with Kayla 10 minutes earlier. Good to see you. I was just finishing up a loan application. Deshaun's coffee mug had gone completely still in his hand. Sir, I had no idea you were coming in today. If someone had told the front desk, we would have... That's rather the point of not telling anyone, Gerald said. Though I understand the instinct. Kayla's stomach had, by this point, dropped somewhere below the floor entirely. She replayed the last 40 minutes in a horrible compressed loop. The flat dismissal. The comment about his age, the folder half closed before she'd finished actually reading half of it. The words, I really can't be spending this much time, delivered to a man who, it was rapidly becoming clear, could have personally authorized or ended her employment with a single sentence. She said nothing. There was, in that particular moment, genuinely nothing adequate to say. Gerald didn't call her out in front of the branch. That wasn't his method. And it had never been. He'd learned decades earlier that public humiliation taught people to hide their mistakes better, not to actually fix them. Instead, he asked Deshawn a single question, delivered quietly enough that only the two of them and Kayla, standing close enough to hear it, caught the words. Deshawn, how many loan applications from applicants over 65 did this branch approve last quarter compared to the branch average? Deshawn didn't know the answer. That, as it turned out, was itself the answer Gerald had been looking for. What happened over the following weeks was not a public firing. And it was not, as Kayla had spent that entire afternoon dreading, the end of her employment. Gerald requested and received a full data review of loan approval patterns across every Meridian Trust branch, broken down by applicant age, appearance-based notes in internal files, and approval to denial ratios that nobody at the bank had ever been asked to examine quite so specifically before. The results confirmed exactly what his 11 years of quiet, unannounced visits had already suggested to him personally. Applicants who looked, in the words of one internal memo nobody had expected a controlling owner to ever read, less financially sophisticated, were being denied at meaningfully higher rates for reasons that had very little to do with their actual creditworthiness. Kayla kept her job. She was notably not fired. Gerald's philosophy, consistent across every branch he'd ever quietly tested, was that a single employee's reflexive bias was a symptom of training and incentive structures the company had built, not a personal failing to be punished in isolation. What she was asked to do instead was harder, in its own way, than losing the job would have been. She sat the following month on a newly formed committee reviewing the bank's loan evaluation criteria, and she was asked specifically to describe out loud to a room of senior staff exactly what had gone through her mind in that 40-minute meeting with Gerald Finch. She did it. It was, she said afterward, the most uncomfortable and most necessary hour of her career. Gerald Finch's loan, incidentally, was approved that same afternoon, not because he needed the $8,000, which he plainly didn't, but because he insisted on completing the process exactly as any other applicant would have, all the way through to the signature, so that the paperwork trail would show precisely how the system was supposed to work once someone with actual authority was paying attention. He still makes his unannounced visits 4 times a year, cardigan and modest watch included, sitting in lobby chairs longer than his own schedule really allows, watching to see what his bank does when it believes nobody important is in the room. He tells the story sometimes to new branch managers during training, and he tends to end it the same way. The person across the desk from you, he says, is never just the file in front of you. You won't always know who they are. That's precisely why it has to be right every single time for every single person, regardless of what you think you already know. If you believe that dignity and fair treatment shouldn't depend on how someone looks, or what you assume about their bank account, please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Tailies, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that everyone deserves to be heard fully before they're judged.